The hall was electric, every seat filled, every camera fixed on the stage where two figures sat beneath the blinding lights. The nation was tuned in, waiting for a clash of ideas. What no one knew was that this night would not be remembered for policy or plans, but for a single moment that cut deeper than any headline. Jasmine Crockett had just finished laying out her argument, her voice steady, her tone precise, her words threading together conviction and lived experience. For a breath, the room was silent, almost reverent. And then, Edward Chen leaned back in his chair, smirk curling across his face, and let out a laugh. Not a nervous chuckle, not a passing slip, a full-bodied, dismissive laugh echoing through the microphones, bouncing off the walls, carrying the weight of mockery. The audience shifted uneasily in their seats. Some gasped, some whispered. The insult wasn't subtle. It was a message. His laugh wasn't just at her. It was at her story, her credibility, her very right to stand at that table. Crockett's eyes didn't flinch. She didn't fumble for words or rush to defend herself. She simply sat there, her expression calm, her hands still, her gaze locked like steel. And in that silence, something shifted. It was the kind of silence that tightens a room, that makes every ear strain, every heart beat faster. Viewers across the country felt it too, the sting of dismissal, the familiar sound of arrogance aimed at those who dare to speak truth. But none of them could have predicted what came next, because while Edward Chen laughed, Jasmine Crockett was about to answer in a way that would leave him and the entire nation stunned. And the moment she opened her mouth, everything changed. The exchange might have looked, to the untrained eye, like just another heated moment in American politics. But beneath the surface, it was something far greater. Jasmine Crockett hadn't been speaking in abstractions. She had been addressing one of the most fundamental questions facing the country: who deserves to be heard? Her argument wasn't about technicalities. It was about respect, about dignity, about the right of every American voice, no matter how marginalized, to claim space in the democratic conversation. She spoke of communities often left out of the debate, families working 2 jobs to survive, immigrants carving new lives against every obstacle, women demanding equal footing in rooms historically designed to shut them out. Her words weren't just statistics and policy points. They carried the weight of lived experience, the quiet strength of those who have always had to prove they belonged. For some in the audience, it was the first time they heard their own struggles spoken on a stage of power. And then came the laugh. Edward Chen's dismissive chuckle wasn't merely an interruption. It was an erasure. It was the sound of centuries of arrogance condensed into one cruel gesture. His laugh told every woman, every immigrant, every person ever belittled for daring to speak, "You don't matter." That's why the room shifted. That's why viewers at home clenched their fists, their stomachs tightening with the old familiar feeling of being laughed at, not because you were wrong, but because you dared to stand tall. The stakes were no longer about one debate. They were about the soul of discourse itself. Would politics remain a stage where mockery silences truth, or could dignity reclaim its rightful place? The answer, everyone would soon learn, would not just decide this debate. It would ripple across the nation. Because what Jasmine Crockett did next was more than a rebuttal. It was a declaration. Edward Chen didn't stumble into politics. He marched in wearing the armor of privilege. Born into wealth, groomed in elite schools, and polished in environments where respect was given, not earned. He carried an air of certainty few could challenge. Every handshake, every smile, every carefully timed joke reinforced one simple message: he belonged, and you didn't. His career was a tapestry of power, leveraged for personal gain. Stories circulated of moments where he dismissed colleagues mid-sentence, laughed off serious proposals, or turned pointed remarks into punchlines at someone else's expense. In interviews, he projected charm, but beneath it was a predictable pattern: mock, dominate, and move on, leaving the targets of his derision off balance, unsure if they'd just been insulted or gaslit. Chen's record wasn't without controversy. Campaign promises he never kept, statements that contradicted his supposed principles, moments where his policies directly harmed the communities he now claimed to champion. And yet, he survived. His laugh, the same one that echoed through the debate hall, was both shield and weapon. To him, it was playful, casual, a signal of superiority. But to anyone on the receiving end, it was a public dismissal, a reminder that hierarchy in politics was real, and you could be laughed out of relevance. It wasn't only his words that stung, it was the consistency of his arrogance. Social media posts, archived debate footage, off-the-record remarks, they all painted the same picture. Chen didn't merely disagree, he ridiculed. He didn't challenge ideas, he undermined confidence. He wasn't the villain in someone else's story by accident. He cultivated that role, knowingly and repeatedly, because power tasted sweeter when others felt small. Yet, for all his self-assuredness, for all the audiences he'd manipulated and belittled, there was a critical flaw. Arrogance, Chen's constant companion, made him blind to moments that required humility. His laugh at Crockett wasn't just another gesture of superiority, it was a crack in his armor. Because history shows that those who rely too heavily on mockery, who treat dignity as expendable, are often undone by the very courage they dismiss. And as he sat there, confident, smirking, letting his laugh linger like a challenge, no one in that hall could yet see the tipping point. But the stage was set, and his arrogance was about to meet something it had never encountered: calm, unwavering resolve. Jasmine Crockett's story was never supposed to be easy. She wasn't born into privilege or handed a ready-made stage. Her life was shaped in the neighborhoods where resilience wasn't a slogan, but a survival skill, where family worked long hours and communities leaned on one another because the system so often failed them. From the start, she carried a deep awareness of what it meant to fight for recognition, for opportunity, for dignity. She excelled in school not because the odds were stacked in her favor, but because she refused to let those odds define her. Teachers described her as relentless, a young woman unwilling to accept the word impossible. She pushed herself through sleepless nights of study, part-time jobs that kept the lights on, and the weight of expectation from a family that wanted more for her than what the world had offered them. That determination carried her to law school, where she quickly developed a reputation as someone who didn't just memorize cases, she lived them. While others sought prestige or lucrative careers, Crockett gravitated toward the clients who couldn't afford a voice: wrongfully accused teenagers, struggling mothers, immigrants navigating the maze of a system stacked against them. These were the people she fought for. Courtrooms became battlegrounds where she proved that truth could pierce through cynicism, that empathy could be wielded as power. But being a black woman in those spaces meant constant underestimation. Colleagues questioned her credentials, opposing attorneys mistook her composure for weakness, and she often found herself speaking twice as loudly just to be heard once. Each slight, each dismissal, each subtle form of erasure forged her into something stronger. She learned to stand tall, not by mimicking arrogance, but by embracing a different kind of strength: calm persistence, dignity, and an unshakable belief that justice mattered. Her transition into politics wasn't born of ambition, but of necessity. She had seen firsthand how laws written far away could devastate lives back home. So she stepped into the arena, not to climb, but to serve. Every campaign stop, every speech, every hand she shook carried the imprint of her journey, the sacrifices of her family, the trust of her clients, the countless nights she spent believing that the fight was bigger than herself. It was never about winning for her. It was about making sure no one else had to feel as invisible as she once did. That perspective became her compass, guiding her through every debate, every vote, every confrontation. And it was this very compass that steadied her on the night Edward Chen laughed. Because Crockett's story wasn't written in the comfort of privilege. It was written in the long shadows of struggle and perseverance. It was written by someone who had been underestimated too many times to count, only to prove again and again that dignity is not fragile, it is unbreakable. And it was this journey that made her uniquely prepared for what would come in that debate hall. The debate had been heated from the start, but as the minutes passed, it became clear this was no ordinary exchange. Edward Chen leaned forward in his chair, interrupting Jasmine Crockett with the ease of someone who believed rules applied to everyone but himself. Each time she began to build her argument, he cut in, sometimes with a sarcastic remark, sometimes with a smirk that said more than words ever could. The cameras caught everything. Viewers at home saw his eyes roll as she spoke, the dismissive wave of his hand, the smirk that spread wider each time she calmly pressed on. In the hall, murmurs began to ripple through the audience. Some leaned forward in discomfort, others glanced at each other, silently acknowledging the imbalance playing out before them. Crockett never raised her voice. She didn't snap back, didn't falter. She delivered her points with the same steady tone she had carried since the opening of the debate, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. The contrast between the two figures was striking, one restless, smug, increasingly desperate to dominate, the other patient, composed, anchored in conviction. And then it happened. Crockett laid down a point so sharp, so rooted in lived truth, that the room seemed to still. Chen paused for a split second, his silence almost acknowledging the weight of her words. But rather than respond with a reason, he leaned back in his chair and burst into laughter. It wasn't just a laugh. It was loud, dismissive, dripping with contempt. The microphones carried it across the room, across the airwaves, into living rooms around the country. Gasps echoed from the audience. Some shook their heads, others frowned, and a few exchanged looks that said, "Did he really just do that?" The laugh seemed to stretch into eternity, not because of its length, but because of what it represented. It was arrogance, weaponized. It was privilege, amplified. It was the sound of someone who believed dignity could be mocked out of existence. Yet, as the noise faded, the camera turned to Jasmine Crockett. Her face remained calm, her eyes fixed forward, her lips pressed into the faintest trace of a smile. No flinch, no retreat, no anger, only quiet, composed strength. The room held its breath. The nation leaned in. And then, with the entire nation watching, she opened her mouth. For a heartbeat, the air inside the hall was thick, charged, almost unbearable. Edward Chen's laughter still echoed in people's ears, but all eyes were fixed on Jasmine Crockett. She leaned slightly forward, her hands folded, her expression unchanged. And then, with the same calmness that had carried her through countless storms, she began to speak. Her voice was steady, almost quiet at first, forcing the room to lean in. "You can laugh at me, Mr. Chen," she said, pausing just long enough to let the words land. "But you cannot laugh away the truth." The audience froze. The rhythm of her tone was deliberate, each syllable chosen, each pause measured. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rush. She owned the silence as much as the sound. "You may think dismissing me makes my point weaker," she continued, her gaze unflinching. "But what it really shows is how afraid you are of facing what I just said." Another pause. The cameras zoomed in on Chen's smirk, faltering now, his eyes shifting as if searching for a cue that never came. Crockett's words built like waves, soft but relentless. "Because when we talk about respect, when we talk about dignity, when we talk about the right of every American, woman, immigrant, worker, neighbor, to be heard, this laugh of yours doesn't erase the truth. It proves it." A hush gripped the hall. Viewers could almost feel the collective intake of breath. "You don't laugh because I'm wrong," she said, her voice rising just slightly, her hand resting firmly on the table. "You laugh because you're uncomfortable, because for once, someone you cannot dismiss is holding a mirror up to your arrogance." The crowd shifted, whispers rippling, a low murmur of agreement spreading like sparks. Crockett leaned back, her voice softening again, the calm after the storm. "But here's the thing, Mr. Chen. I'm not here for your approval. I'm here for the people who've been laughed at their entire lives and kept going anyway. I'm here for those who have been told they don't belong and still stood tall. I'm here for them, and no amount of laughter will silence that truth." The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, the hall seemed suspended in time. Then, slowly, applause began, scattered at first, then swelling, then erupting into a roar that filled the room. People rose to their feet. Some clapped, others shouted, others simply stood in awe of the composure they had just witnessed. And on the other side of the stage, Edward Chen's face told its own story. The smirk was gone. His eyes darted nervously, his jaw tightened, his hand gripped the edge of the desk as though he might steady himself against the force of her words. The laugh that once seemed so confident now looked hollow, cheap, small. Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't smile triumphantly. She simply sat in her chair, calm, composed, letting the applause crash around her like waves. Because she knew the point had been made. Dignity had spoken louder than arrogance. But it wasn't just the room that reacted. The shockwaves traveled far beyond. The roar of applause in the hall was only the beginning. Within minutes of the debate's conclusion, clips of Jasmine Crockett's calm takedown flooded social media. The moment Chen's laugh cut through the air, followed by Crockett's piercing reply, spread like wildfire across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Hashtags sprang up instantly. #Compower, #LaughNoMore, #Crockett Clapback. The video racked up hundreds of thousands of views in the first hour, millions by the end of the night. Comment sections filled with stories from ordinary people who saw themselves in Crockett's composure. "That's exactly how my boss talks to me," one user wrote. "Thank you, Jasmine, for showing us how dignity wins." Another shared, "As an immigrant, I know that laugh. I've heard it all my life. Watching her silence him, this gave me hope." For every sneer Chen had ever thrown in public, the internet now offered a counterweight, a flood of validation, solidarity, and joy. Journalists seized on the moment. Major outlets replayed the clip on loop, analyzing every pause, every flicker of Chen's face as the smirk disappeared. Editorial headlines captured the mood. Crockett turns mockery into power. When calm beats arrogance, the laugh heard round the country. Late-night hosts wove it into monologues, comedians reenacted the exchange, and memes painted Chen as the butt of the very joke he had tried to make. But it wasn't only supporters who amplified it. Unexpected figures joined the chorus. A celebrity known for staying apolitical tweeted simply, "Respect." A retired general remarked, "That's leadership." Even commentators from the opposite side of the spectrum admitted, grudgingly, that Crockett had delivered a masterclass in composure. Every new endorsement pushed the clip further, transforming it from a debate highlight into a cultural milestone. Meanwhile, Chen's defenders scrambled. Some tried to dismiss the laugh as harmless banter. Others insisted it was taken out of context. But the footage was undeniable. Every replay, every slowed-down clip, every meme reminded the public that the sound of that laugh, and the silence that followed, spoke louder than any spin. The moment transcended politics. It became a symbol. Students began quoting Crockett's lines in classrooms. Workers shared the clip in group chats after meetings where their own voices had been overlooked. Activists replayed it at rallies, pointing to it as proof that calm truth still has a place in public life. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett remained steady. She didn't gloat, didn't mock in return. In interviews the next day, she simply said, "I've been laughed at before. What matters is how we respond." That humility only deepened the resonance. People weren't just celebrating a debate win. They were celebrating a way of being. Because in a world too often ruled by noise and arrogance, Crockett had shown that dignity could ripple farther than mockery ever could. In the days that followed, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's exchange was no longer just a piece of political theater. It became a parable. What viewers saw was more than a debate tactic. It was proof of something deeper, something enduring, that dignity holds a power arrogance can never match. When Chen laughed, it was meant to shrink her, to cast her aside as unworthy of serious attention. But her calm answer flipped the meaning of that moment. She showed that laughter, when wielded as a weapon, is hollow. Composure, when rooted in conviction, is unshakable. By refusing to take the bait, she transformed ridicule into revelation. Her words spoke to more than the audience in that hall. They spoke to every person who has been underestimated because of their gender, their race, their accent, their background. To every immigrant told their story didn't count. To every worker whose ideas were dismissed in the boardroom. To every young woman who dared to raise her voice in a room that wanted her silent. Crockett's reply carried a universal promise. You are not defined by their laughter. You are defined by your strength. The lesson reached beyond politics. It wasn't about left or right, winning or losing. It was about the timeless struggle between arrogance and dignity, between mockery and truth. History is full of moments where the loud tried to drown out the steady, where the privileged tried to erase the persistent. And again, it is dignity that endures. For Crockett, the victory was never about humiliating Chen. It was about showing that in the face of derision, calm confidence is not weakness, but the purest form of strength. Her response turned a petty laugh into a rallying cry. And that is why people across the country felt something shift inside them when they watched, because they recognized themselves. They remembered every time they had been dismissed, and they saw, maybe for the first time, how powerfully they could answer. Dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't sneer. It stands firm, looks arrogance in the eye, and says, "You cannot erase me." That was Jasmine Crockett's gift in that moment, and it is the lesson that will outlast the laughter. Edward Chen thought a laugh could erase Jasmine Crockett's words. Instead, it lit the stage for one of the most unforgettable moments in recent political memory. Her calm response didn't just silence arrogance. It elevated truth, showing the world that composure can be the sharpest weapon of all. That night was bigger than politics. It was a reminder that dignity is not weakness, that calmness is not surrender. For anyone who has ever been mocked, dismissed, or underestimated, Crockett's answer was proof that strength doesn't always roar. It sometimes speaks softly, clearly, and leaves the room changed forever. And that's why this moment matters. Not just because Chen's smirk crumbled, but because every person watching felt the weight of it. The validation that arrogance can be defeated without matching its cruelty. If you felt that too, don't let it end here. Share this story. Subscribe for more moments where dignity triumphs over mockery. And stand with those who choose calm strength in the face of disrespect, because every voice deserves to be heard. Because sometimes, the most powerful answer to arrogance is calm truth.